Brussels, 1943. A black Mercedes sedan pulls up to the front gates of a Catholic boarding school on Rue de la Glacière. Two SS officers step out, their boots striking the cobblestones with deliberate menace. They carry a list of names, typewritten in German, each one a Jewish child rumored to be hidden somewhere in this city of whispers and shadows. The lead officer, Obersturmführer Klaus Barbie's local counterpart, adjusts his leather gloves and walks toward the entrance with absolute confidence. He believes the paperwork never lies. He believes systems cannot be fooled. He believes that by the end of this day, he will have 20 or 30 terrified children loaded into trucks, bound for Malines, the assembly camp that feeds the rail lines to Auschwitz. What he doesn't know is that he's walking into the most elaborate paper trap ever constructed by a 5'2" nun who never fired a gun, never threw a punch, but who will save more lives than most resistance fighters ever dreamed of. Sister Marie Adèle was not born a hero. She was born Mathilde d'Herbe in 1898 in a rural Belgian village, where the most dangerous thing she ever faced was a late frost ruining the potato harvest. She entered the convent at 19, took her vows at 21, and spent the next 2 decades teaching arithmetic and catechism to girls from good Catholic families. She was quiet, methodical, and utterly unremarkable. The other nuns considered her kind, but boring. The students thought she was strict but fair. No one would have guessed that beneath her habit and rosary beads was a mind capable of outmaneuvering the entire Nazi bureaucratic machine. But war has a way of revealing who people truly are. And when the Germans rolled into Belgium in May of 1940, when the deportations began in 1942, when Jewish families started appearing at the convent door in the dead of night, with children clutching stuffed animals and whispering goodbyes, Sister Marie Adèle discovered something about herself. She discovered she was willing to lie, forge, and manipulate every rule she'd ever been taught to follow. Belgium in 1943 was a country carved into pieces. The Germans controlled the cities, the infrastructure, the records. Collaboration was common, resistance was dangerous, and neutrality was a luxury no one could afford. The Jewish population, once integrated into Belgian society, was now marked, registered, and systematically hunted. The Gestapo didn't need to search every building. They had lists, they had addresses, they had informants, and they had the one weapon no rebel army could fight: paperwork. Every child in Belgium was supposed to be accounted for. Baptism records, school enrollment forms, ration cards, medical files. The Nazis believed in the power of documentation, and they were right to. You couldn't hide in plain sight without the paper trail to support your existence. And that's exactly where Sister Marie Adèle saw the crack in their armor. The convent where she worked, the Institut de la Vierge Fidèle, was a boarding school for girls. It had dormitories, classrooms, a chapel, and most importantly, it had files, enrollment records, tuition receipts, health inspections, all the bureaucratic debris that proved a child belonged there. When the first Jewish mother arrived at the side door with her daughter, begging Sister Marie Adèle to take her in, the nun didn't hesitate. She said yes, but she didn't just hide the girl in the attic or the cellar like so many others were doing across Europe. That was a temporary solution, a death sentence waiting to happen the moment the SS decided to search the building. Instead, Sister Marie Adèle did something far more dangerous and far more brilliant. She gave the girl a new identity on paper. She opened the school's ledger, grabbed a pen, and wrote down a false name. A Catholic name, Marie Dupont, baptized at St. Catherine's in Ghent. Parents killed in an air raid, orphaned, enrolled. She forged a birth certificate using the convent's official letterhead. She backdated a tuition payment receipt. She even added a handwritten note in the margin about the girl's supposed allergy to strawberries, the kind of mundane detail that makes a lie feel real. And then she filed it all away, crisp and neat, in the cabinet with the other 312 students. When the second mother arrived 2 nights later, she did it again, and again, and again. By the end of 1942, Sister Marie Adèle had created an entire phantom orphanage within the real one, a paper institution that existed only in her files, but could withstand any inspection. The system she built was terrifyingly simple and devastatingly effective. Every Jewish child who arrived was immediately scrubbed of their identity. Their real names were memorized, never written down. Their photographs were destroyed. Their parents' letters were burned after being read. In exchange, they received a new life, a new baptism certificate forged with stolen church seals. A new set of school records seamlessly inserted into the convent's official files. A new backstory, usually tragic, always Catholic, designed to explain why they had no relatives to visit or vouch for them. The children were taught to recite the Lord's Prayer, to cross themselves, to answer to their false names without hesitation. And Sister Marie Adèle kept 2 sets of books, one for the Nazis, pristine and perfectly legal, one hidden in the convent cellar, locked in a metal box, containing the real names of every child she'd saved, because she knew that someday, if they survived, those children would need to know who they really were. The danger escalated throughout 1943 at a pace that would have broken most people. The Gestapo wasn't stupid, and they weren't lazy. They knew that convents, monasteries, and Catholic institutions across Belgium were hiding Jews. Raids became routine. SS officers would arrive unannounced, demanding to see enrollment records, ration card distributions, baptism certificates. They would walk through dormitories, staring at the faces of sleeping children, looking for the telltale signs, darker features, nervous glances, a child who flinched when called by their new name. Other convents were caught. Children were dragged out screaming. Nuns were arrested, interrogated, sometimes sent to camps themselves. The risks were not theoretical. They were constant, suffocating, and absolutely real. And yet, Sister Marie Adèle never stopped. Every time a new Jewish family appeared at the convent door, she opened it. But she wasn't working alone, and that was the key to her survival. The convent's Mother Superior, Sister Clotilde, knew exactly what was happening and gave her silent approval. Several other nuns were brought into the conspiracy, each one assigned a specific role. Sister Jeanne handled the forged ration cards, using connections with a sympathetic clerk at the municipal office. Sister Thérèse taught the children their new Catholic identities, drilling them on prayers and saints until the words became automatic. Sister Hélène managed the incoming and outgoing correspondence, making sure no letter ever mentioned a Jewish name or hinted at the truth. They operated like a resistance cell, compartmentalized and careful, trusting each other, but never speaking openly about what they were doing. If the Gestapo ever tortured one of them, the others could claim ignorance. It was cold, calculated, and absolutely necessary. The children themselves became part of the deception, though many were too young to fully understand the stakes. They ranged in age from 4 to 14, and each one carried the weight of a secret that could kill them. The older girls understood. They knew that if they slipped, if they called out their real name in their sleep or forgot to cross themselves before meals, everyone in the convent could die. The younger ones were told it was a game, a very serious game where they had to pretend to be someone else until the war ended. Some adapted quickly, losing themselves in their new identities with the frightening ease of childhood. Others struggled, crying at night for parents they would never see again, whispering their real names into pillows like prayers. Sister Marie Adèle would sit with them, holding their hands, promising them that their names were safe, that she had written them down, that they would not be forgotten. The paperwork itself became a kind of obsession for Sister Marie Adèle. She studied German administrative procedures, memorizing the fonts, the stamps, the bureaucratic language that made documents official. She cultivated relationships with sympathetic officials in the local government, people who could provide blank birth certificates or look the other way when records didn't quite match. She learned to forge signatures so perfectly that even experts couldn't tell the difference. Her handwriting became a weapon, each stroke of the pen a small act of resistance. She created entire family trees for children who had none, inventing dead parents, fictitious godparents, and tragic backstories that explained away every inconsistency. The phantom orphanage grew larger and more elaborate with each passing month, a cathedral of lies built to house the truth. By the summer of 1943, Sister Marie Adèle had over 200 Jewish children hidden in plain sight at the Institut de la Vierge Fidèle. 200 lives balanced on the edge of a pen stroke, protected by nothing more than paper, ink, and the desperate hope that the Nazis would never look closely enough to see through the illusion. And then the SS came knocking. That black Mercedes on Rue de la Glacière wasn't a coincidence. Someone had talked. Someone had given them names. And Obersturmführer Schneider, the man stepping out of that car, had a reputation for never leaving empty-handed. Sister Marie Adèle was in the convent's administrative office when she heard the car pull up. She recognized the sound immediately, that low mechanical growl that German vehicles made, different from the sputtering civilian cars that still limped through Brussels on rationed fuel. She moved to the window and saw them, 2 SS officers, crisp uniforms, sidearms holstered but visible. Her heart didn't race. It couldn't. She had trained herself over the past year to control every physical response, every flicker of fear that could give her away. She smoothed her habit, checked that her veil was straight, and walked calmly to the front entrance. By the time the officers reached the door, she was already there, opening it before they could knock, her face a mask of serene Catholic hospitality. "Good morning, gentlemen. How may the Institut de la Vierge Fidèle serve you today?" Obersturmführer Schneider was a man who believed in efficiency. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or threats. He simply pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to Sister Marie Adèle. It was a list, 23 names, Jewish children, ages ranging from 6 to 13. The intelligence report attached claimed that these children were currently enrolled at this very convent under false identities. Schneider watched her face as she read, looking for the micro-expressions that betrayed guilt. A tightening around the eyes, a slight pallor, a tremor in the hands. He saw nothing. Sister Marie Adèle read the list slowly, her lips moving slightly as if sounding out unfamiliar names, and then she looked up at him with genuine confusion. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake, Obersturmführer. None of these names appear in our enrollment records. We keep very thorough documentation. Would you like to review our files?" This was the moment where everything could collapse. Schneider wasn't an idiot. He knew that Jewish children were being hidden under Catholic names. That was the entire point of the list. His informant had given him the real names, the Jewish names, precisely because he knew the convent would deny recognizing them. But Schneider also knew that the best way to catch a liar was to let them dig their own grave. He nodded. "Yes, sister. Show me your records." "All of them." Sister Marie Adèle led him and his partner into the office, her movements unhurried, and pulled out the massive leather-bound ledger that contained the official enrollment records for the school. She opened it on the desk, turning pages with the practiced ease of someone who had nothing to hide. 347 students currently enrolled. Here are their names, their dates of enrollment, their baptism records, and their tuition payments. Feel free to cross-reference. Schneider spent the next 2 hours going through every page. He checked names against his list. He demanded to see birth certificates, and Sister Marie Adèle produced them, each one perfectly forged, each one stamped with official seals from parishes across Belgium. He asked to see the children themselves, and she complied, leading him through the dormitories and classrooms, where girls sat reading, sewing, and praying. He stopped in front of several, asking their names, their ages, where they were from. The children answered without hesitation, their false identities worn like second skins. One girl, no more than 8 years old, recited the Hail Mary in flawless French when Schneider demanded proof of her Catholic upbringing. Another showed him a small silver crucifix around her neck, a gift, she said, from her late mother. Schneider saw dark eyes, olive skin, features that could have been Jewish or could have been southern Belgian or could have been anything. Suspicion was not proof. By the time Schneider left, empty-handed and visibly frustrated, Sister Marie Adèle's hands were shaking, but she didn't let them shake until the black Mercedes was out of sight. She stood in the doorway, watching the car disappear down Rue de la Glacière, and only then did she allow herself to breathe. She had won this round, but she knew with absolute certainty that they would come back. The SS always came back. And next time, they would bring more than a list. They would bring dogs, informants, torture if necessary. The Phantom Orphanage had survived its first real test, but the war was far from over and the body count was still climbing. The close call with Schneider forced Sister Marie Adèle to evolve her system. It was no longer enough to simply forge documents and hope the Nazis wouldn't look too closely. She needed redundancy, layers of deception so thick that even if one part of the lie was exposed, the rest would hold. She began creating backup identities for the highest-risk children, complete with alternate birth certificates and enrollment records at fictional schools in bombed-out towns where the municipal offices no longer existed. If a child's paperwork was ever questioned, she could produce a second set, claiming the first was an administrative error. She also started moving children between safe houses, rotating them through a network of sympathetic families and religious institutions across Brussels and beyond. A girl who spent 3 months at the convent might suddenly be transferred to a monastery in Liège or a farmhouse in the Ardennes, her paper trail updated to reflect a sick relative or a scholarship opportunity. The phantom orphanage was no longer just one building. It was a web, sprawling and invisible, that stretched across occupied Belgium. But the psychological toll on Sister Marie Adèle was staggering. She slept 3 or 4 hours a night, waking in cold sweats from nightmares where SS officers tore through her files and found the metal box in the cellar. She lost weight, her habit hanging looser on her frame with each passing month. The other nuns noticed but said nothing. What could they say? Stop saving children. The guilt was just as crushing as the fear. For every child she saved, there were dozens she had to turn away because there simply wasn't room, or because the risk was too great. Mothers would arrive at the convent door, begging, pleading, offering money they didn't have, and Sister Marie Adèle would have to say no. She would have to close the door and listen to them walk away, knowing that those children would likely be dead within weeks. The math was brutal and inescapable. She could save some, but not all. And every no felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. The children, meanwhile, were adapting to their double lives in ways that were both inspiring and heartbreaking. The older girls became fiercely protective of the younger ones, teaching them the prayers, correcting their mistakes before the nuns could notice, creating a silent support system that operated entirely outside adult supervision. They developed codes, subtle gestures that meant danger or all clear, ways of communicating without words. Some of them thrived in their new identities, embracing Catholicism with a fervor that seemed almost genuine. Others retreated inward, becoming quiet and watchful, their real selves buried so deep that even Sister Marie Adèle worried they might never resurface. There were moments of normalcy, brief flashes where the war felt distant and the convent felt safe, a girl laughing during a lesson, a group singing hymns in the chapel. But those moments were fragile, always one knock on the door away from shattering. The resistance networks that Sister Marie Adèle had quietly connected with became more active as 1943 wore on. She wasn't a fighter, didn't carry weapons or sabotage rail lines, but she was recognized as valuable. Her forgery skills were unmatched, and resistance operatives began bringing her requests: false identity papers for downed Allied pilots, travel permits for Jews trying to escape to Switzerland, even discharge papers for Belgian men trying to avoid forced labor in German factories. She said yes to all of it, working late into the night by candlelight, her fingers cramping from the repetitive strokes of the pen. Each document she created was a tiny act of defiance, a paper bullet fired at the Nazi machine. But it also meant more risk, more exposure, more chances for something to go wrong. And then, in October of 1943, something did go wrong. One of the children, a 10-year-old girl named Rachel who had been living as Marie Colombe for nearly a year, was recognized by a former neighbor while walking through the market with Sister Jeanne. The neighbor, a Belgian collaborator looking to curry favor with the Germans, followed them back to the convent and reported what he'd seen. Within days, the Gestapo had opened a full investigation into the Institut de la Vierge Fidèle. This time, they weren't sending 2 officers with a list. They were sending an entire team with orders to tear the place apart until they found what they were looking for. Sister Marie Adèle learned about the investigation through a terrified telephone call from Father Dubois, a priest who worked in the municipal records office and had been feeding her blank certificates for months. The Gestapo had been asking questions, cross-referencing baptism records from multiple parishes, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what yet. Father Dubois estimated she had maybe 48 hours before they came with a full search warrant, and the kind of manpower that would make Schneider's visit look like a courtesy call. 48 hours to hide 183 Jewish children who were living under false names in a building that was about to be turned inside out. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have started burning documents and scattering children into the night, creating chaos that would guarantee discovery. Sister Marie Adèle did neither. She had been preparing for this moment since the day she forged her first baptism certificate. The evacuation plan she activated was something she had been refining in her mind for months, a complex choreography that required perfect timing and absolute trust. She gathered the senior nuns in the chapel and explained the situation in a voice that allowed no room for doubt or fear. The children would be moved in waves, small groups of 5 or 6, transported to safe houses across Brussels using a network of sympathetic families and clergy that she had cultivated. Each group would leave at different times, using different routes, accompanied by nuns in civilian clothes, who could pass as aunts or family friends. The youngest children, those most likely to panic or make mistakes, would go first. The teenagers who could think quickly and lie convincingly would go last. And the paperwork, the precious files that proved these children existed as Catholics, would remain in place. Removing them would be an admission of guilt. The phantom orphanage had to continue operating on paper, even as it emptied in reality. The first group left that night. 6 girls, ages 4 to 7, dressed in their best clothing and carrying small suitcases as if going on holiday. Sister Thérèse walked them to a tram stop 3 blocks away, where a Belgian schoolteacher named Madame Laurent was waiting. She took the children to her apartment, fed them soup and put them to bed in her spare room. No one on the tram looked twice at a woman traveling with children. The second group left the following morning, escorted by Sister Hélène to a farmhouse outside the city where the owner had agreed to hide them in a barn loft. By noon, 40 children were gone. By evening, 80. The convent felt emptier with each departure, the silence in the dormitories growing louder and more ominous. Sister Marie Adèle moved through the building like a ghost, checking and rechecking her lists, making sure every child had been accounted for, every destination confirmed. She barely ate, barely slept, running on adrenaline and prayer. But the logistics of moving 183 children without attracting attention was staggering. Some of the safe houses backed out at the last minute, too terrified to take the risk. Sister Marie Adèle had to scramble, finding alternate locations, sometimes keeping children hidden in the convent's cellar for an extra night while she made new arrangements. The older girls were the hardest to place because they looked too Jewish, their features too distinct, their eyes too knowing. She sent them to convents in remote villages where strangers were rare and questions were fewer. One girl, 14 years old and sharp as a knife, refused to leave. She wanted to stay and help with the evacuation. Sister Marie Adèle had to physically push her out the door, handing her to a priest who promised to take her to a monastery near the French border. The girl cried. Sister Marie Adèle did not. She couldn't afford to. By the time the Gestapo arrived, 36 hours after Father Dubois' warning, only 12 children remained in the convent. 12 out of 183. They were the ones Sister Marie Adèle judged least at risk, the ones with the most flawless paperwork and the most convincing Catholic performances. She had gambled everything on the belief that the Nazis would search, would interrogate, would tear through her files, but would ultimately find nothing concrete enough to justify mass arrests. It was a desperate, impossible gamble. And as she opened the door to face Hauptsturmführer Weber and his team of 8 officers, she had no idea if it would work. Hauptsturmführer Weber was not like Schneider. Where Schneider had been methodical and cold, Weber was theatrical and cruel. He swept into the convent like a man who had already won, his boots echoing on the stone floors, his voice booming through the corridors. He brought 8 men with him, not just officers but specialists, a document examiner from Berlin, an interrogator known for breaking resistance operatives, even a so-called racial expert who claimed he could identify Jewish children by measuring skull dimensions and examining eye color. This was not an inspection. It was an inquisition. Weber made his intentions clear from the beginning. He didn't just want to find hidden Jews. He wanted to make an example of the nuns who had dared to defy the Reich. He wanted arrests, public trials, executions if possible. And he had time. He informed Sister Marie Adèle that his team would be staying as long as necessary, days or even weeks, until they uncovered the truth he was certain existed beneath her lies. The search began immediately and was more invasive than anything Sister Marie Adèle had anticipated. Weber's men tore through the dormitories, pulling mattresses off beds, ripping up floorboards, checking for hidden compartments. They searched the chapel, the kitchen, the laundry rooms, even the cellar where the metal box containing the real names sat hidden behind a false wall that Sister Marie Adèle had constructed months earlier. They interrogated the nuns one by one, separating them into different rooms, asking the same questions over and over, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They brought in the 12 remaining children and questioned them harshly, the racial expert examining their faces under bright lights, measuring noses and jawlines with calipers like they were specimens in a laboratory. One girl, 9 years old, broke down crying when he grabbed her face. She stammered out the Hail Mary through her tears, and Weber waved the expert away, disgusted. "Crying proves nothing," he muttered. The document examiner spent 3 full days reviewing Sister Marie Adèle's files, and this was the moment she had truly feared. He was good at his job, trained to spot forgeries, familiar with every type of official seal and signature used in Belgian administration. He examined the baptism certificates under magnifying glasses, held them up to the light, compared the typewriter fonts on different documents. He found inconsistencies, small ones, a seal that was slightly smudged, a signature that didn't quite match another example from the same priest, a date that seemed improbable given the timeline of parish records. He brought these findings to Weber with a kind of academic pride, certain he had caught the nun in her lies. Weber summoned Sister Marie Adèle to the office and spread the documents across the desk. "Explain these, sister." She didn't hesitate. She walked him through each inconsistency with the patient tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. The smudged seal was because Father Gaston had arthritis, and his hands shook when applying stamps. The signature variation was because priests often signed documents in a hurry, and handwriting naturally changed over time. The improbable date was actually correct. The examiner had simply miscalculated based on an outdated parish calendar. Weber wanted to believe he had her. He wanted it so badly he could taste it. But Sister Marie Adèle had built her lies with such meticulous care, layered with so much authentic detail and corroborating paperwork, that even the expert couldn't definitively prove forgery. And that was the problem with the Nazi obsession with documentation. If the paperwork was perfect, or even close enough to perfect, it became the truth. Weber couldn't arrest her based on suspicion alone. He needed proof. He needed a child to break, a nun to confess, a document that was undeniably false, and he wasn't getting any of those things. The nuns held firm under interrogation, their stories matching perfectly because they were telling the same carefully rehearsed version of events. The children performed their Catholic identities flawlessly, reciting prayers and catechism with the automaticity of true believers. And the documents, despite the minor inconsistencies, were fundamentally sound. On the 4th day, Weber made his final play. He arrested Sister Marie Adèle and 3 other nuns, charging them with conspiracy to harbor enemies of the Reich, based on the testimony of the collaborator who had recognized Rachel in the market. He transported them to Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Louise, threw them into cells, and began the kind of interrogation that involved more than just questions. Sister Marie Adèle was beaten, deprived of sleep, threatened with execution. They showed her photographs of other nuns who had been caught hiding Jews, women who had been sent to Ravensbrück and never returned. They promised her that if she confessed, if she gave them the names and locations of the children she had moved, they would show mercy. She said nothing. For 3 days she endured, and she said absolutely nothing. What Weber and his interrogators didn't understand was that Sister Marie Adèle had already made peace with death. She had made that decision the night she forged her first baptism certificate, the moment she opened the convent door to that first terrified Jewish mother. She had known then that this work would likely kill her, and she had accepted it as the price of doing what was right. The physical pain they inflicted was real. The exhaustion crushing, but none of it mattered, because they couldn't threaten her with something she had already surrendered. They could beat her until her ribs cracked. They could deprive her of sleep until she hallucinated. They could even execute her in a courtyard at dawn, but they couldn't make her betray the children. And so she sat in that cell, her body broken, but her mind clear, and she told them nothing. Not a single name, not a single location, nothing. The other nuns held just as firm, and this collective silence created a problem for Weber that he hadn't anticipated. Without a confession, without concrete evidence beyond the word of a single collaborator, his case was weak. The Belgian authorities, even those who cooperated with the Germans, were reluctant to execute Catholic nuns without ironclad proof. The Church still held enormous influence in Belgium, and public executions of clergy could spark riots or strengthen the resistance. Weber needed more. He sent officers to track down some of the children who had been evacuated, hoping to find them and force them to testify, but Sister Marie Adèle's network was too scattered, too well hidden. The safe houses had been chosen specifically because they were remote or anonymous, places where a few extra children wouldn't attract attention. The Gestapo found nothing, and after 6 days of interrogation, threats, and torture that yielded zero usable intelligence, Weber was forced to admit defeat. Sister Marie Adèle and the 3 other nuns were released on October 28, 1943, not because the Gestapo believed them innocent, but because they couldn't prove them guilty. Weber made it clear as he shoved her out of the headquarters building that this wasn't over. "We'll be watching you, sister. Every move, every visitor, every child who walks through your door. One mistake and you're finished." She nodded, her face bruised and swollen, and walked back to the convent in the cold autumn rain. She had won, but the cost was visible in every step she took. The other nuns wept when they saw her. The 12 children who remained stared in silent horror at what the Gestapo had done. But Sister Marie Adèle didn't cry, didn't collapse. She simply asked for a basin of water to clean her wounds and a pen to update her records. The convent, however, could no longer function as it had before. Weber had been telling the truth when he said they would be watched. The Gestapo placed the Institut de la Vierge Fidèle under permanent surveillance, with informants stationed nearby to report on everyone who entered or left. Taking in new Jewish children was now impossible. The Phantom Orphanage, at least in its original form, was finished, but Sister Marie Adèle's work was not. She had learned something crucial during her time in that cell, something that would define the final year of the war. She had learned that the Nazis could destroy buildings, arrest people, even torture nuns, but they couldn't destroy a network built on paper. The 171 children she had evacuated were still alive, still hidden, still protected by the false identities she had created. And as long as those documents existed, as long as the web of lies held together, the children would survive. She shifted her focus entirely to maintenance and coordination. She could no longer hide children in the convent, but she could keep the existing network running. She made secret trips to the safe houses, traveling in civilian clothes, carrying forged travel permits, checking on the children and updating their paperwork as needed. A girl who had grown too old for her false birth certificate would need a new one. A family that was getting nervous about harboring a Jewish child would need reassurance or a replacement location. A ration card that was about to expire would need to be renewed with forged signatures. Sister Marie Adèle became a traveling administrator of her own phantom bureaucracy, a one-woman resistance operation that existed entirely on paper trails and whispered promises. The Gestapo watched the convent, but they couldn't watch everywhere. And so she slipped through the cracks again and again, keeping her impossible system alive. By the spring of 1944, the war had shifted in ways that gave desperate hope to occupied Europe, but also made the Nazis more vicious and unpredictable. The Allies were advancing in Italy. The Soviets were pushing from the east. Everyone knew an invasion of France was coming, though no one knew when. In Belgium, the deportations intensified as the Germans tried to finish what they had started, rounding up every last Jew they could find before the Reich collapsed. The Gestapo became more aggressive, more willing to act on thin evidence, more brutal in their interrogations. Safe houses that had held for years were suddenly raided. Resistance networks that had operated in secrecy were betrayed by informants desperate to save themselves. And Sister Marie Adèle, despite her caution, despite her meticulous planning, came dangerously close to losing everything she had built. The crisis came in June, just days before the D-Day landings that no one in Belgium knew were about to happen. One of the families hiding a Jewish girl, a baker and his wife in Antwerp, were arrested on unrelated black market charges. Under interrogation, terrified and looking for leniency, the baker mentioned that they had been harboring a child for a Catholic nun from Brussels. He didn't know Sister Marie Adèle's name, didn't even know which convent she was from, but he described her well enough that the Gestapo made the connection. They came for her again, this time not to the convent but to a farmhouse outside Leuven, where she was updating paperwork for 3 hidden children. She saw the cars approaching from the window and had maybe 90 seconds to react. She couldn't run. Running would confirm her guilt and lead them straight to the children upstairs. So she did the only thing she could. She burned the documents she was working on in the farmhouse stove, shoved the ashes deep into the coals, and walked outside to meet them as if she had simply been visiting friends. The officer in charge, a Gestapo lieutenant named Kraus, didn't bother with formalities. He grabbed her by the arm, searched her for papers, and found nothing. He dragged her back inside and tore the farmhouse apart, looking for evidence, for children, for anything. The family who owned the farm played their roles perfectly, acting confused and offended, insisting that Sister Marie Adèle was simply a family friend who visited occasionally. The 3 children hiding in the attic stayed absolutely silent, barely breathing, praying in their heads because they had been trained never to pray aloud when danger was near. Kraus didn't find them. The attic entrance was hidden behind a false wall in a closet, a modification the farmer had made specifically for this purpose. But Kraus did find ash in the stove, still warm, and he knew she had burned something. "What were you destroying, sister?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Old letters from my mother. She passed away last month and I couldn't bear to keep them." He didn't believe her, but he couldn't prove otherwise. Ash was ash. And without physical evidence, without the documents she had been working on, he had nothing. But Kraus wasn't stupid, and he wasn't done. He arrested Sister Marie Adèle on suspicion of resistance activity and brought her back to Brussels for another round of interrogation. This time they didn't just beat her. They brought in a specialist, a man who had broken British agents and Polish partisans, someone who understood that physical pain had limits, but psychological torture did not. They showed her photographs, not of herself, not of other nuns, but of children. Jewish children who had been caught, arrested, sent to Malines and then to Auschwitz. They told her in explicit detail what happened to those children in the camps. They described the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the medical experiments, and then they told her that every child she was hiding would suffer the same fate unless she gave them names and locations. They told her that her silence wasn't heroism. It was selfishness. It was vanity. It was choosing her own moral purity over the lives of children who would die because of her stubbornness. It almost worked. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sister Marie Adèle felt her resolve crack. Not because she believed them, but because the doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if her refusal to cooperate would lead to even more suffering? What if she could negotiate, trade some information for leniency, save more lives by compromising? She spent a night in her cell turning this over in her mind, praying for guidance, and finding none. And then she remembered something one of the older girls had told her months ago, a 14-year-old named Sarah, who was now hiding in a monastery near Bruges. Sarah had said, "If they catch me, I want to know that you didn't give me up. I want to know that I mattered enough for you to stay silent." That memory, that simple statement of trust, pulled Sister Marie Adèle back from the edge. She would not break, not for threats, not for guilt, not for anything. Sister Marie Adèle was released again after 8 days, not because the Gestapo believed her innocence, but because the war was collapsing around them and they had bigger problems. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6th changed everything. Within weeks it was clear that the Germans were losing, that Belgium would be liberated, that the 1,000-year Reich had maybe months left instead of centuries. The Gestapo shifted their priorities from hunting hidden Jews to preparing for retreat, destroying evidence of their crimes and trying to escape before the advancing Allied forces could capture them. Weber, Krauss, and the others who had interrogated Sister Marie Adèle disappeared into the chaos, some fleeing to Germany, others simply vanishing into the confusion of a collapsing occupation. The convent was no longer under surveillance. The safe houses were no longer being raided. And for the first time in 2 years, Sister Marie Adèle allowed herself to believe that the children might actually survive. Brussels was liberated on September 3, 1944, by British and Canadian forces who were greeted as heroes by crowds that had been waiting 4 years for this moment. The streets erupted in celebration. Belgian flags appeared on every building. Collaborators were dragged from their homes and beaten in public squares. Sister Marie Adèle watched the liberation from the convent steps, her face bruised and her body still aching from the interrogations, and she felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, not vindication, just exhaustion. The war wasn't over. Children were still scattered across Belgium, living under false names, many of them traumatized beyond measure. Parents were still missing, most of them dead, and she had a metal box hidden in the cellar containing the real names of 171 children who no longer knew who they were. The celebration in the streets felt obscene to her, premature, a denial of how much had been lost. The reunifications began almost immediately and were more heartbreaking than anything Sister Marie Adèle had experienced during the war itself. Some parents survived the camps and came looking for their children, carrying photographs, reciting names, desperate and skeletal and barely alive. Sister Marie Adèle would consult her hidden records, locate the child, and arrange the reunion. Some of these meetings were joyful, tears and embraces and promises to never be separated again. But most were tragedies. Children who didn't recognize their own parents because they had been too young when separated. Parents who found their children alive but so changed, so Catholic, so convinced of their false identities that they refused to acknowledge their real names. One mother found her daughter after 2 years of searching, only to have the girl, now 12, tell her in perfect French that her name was Marie Thérèse, that she was a good Catholic, and that she didn't know anyone named Rachel. The mother collapsed. Sister Marie Adèle had to help her to a chair, had to explain that it would take time, that the girl had buried her real self so deeply to survive that it might take months or years to bring her back. Many parents never came at all because they were dead. Out of the 171 children Sister Marie Adèle had saved, only 43 were ever reunited with surviving family members. The rest became true orphans, their parents murdered in Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen or shot in mass graves across Eastern Europe. These children had to be placed in Jewish orphanages or adopted by relatives they barely knew, if any relatives existed at all. Sister Marie Adèle attended as many of these placements as she could, making sure each child had their real name restored, their history acknowledged, their survival documented. But the guilt crushed her. She had saved their lives but couldn't save their families. She had given them false identities to survive, but now those identities clung to them like ghosts, some children never fully able to reclaim who they had been before the war. And then there were the children who were never found, 23 names in her metal box that she couldn't match to any child who had survived. She didn't know if they had died, been recaptured despite her efforts, or simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. She searched for them for years, writing letters to orphanages and aid organizations, checking records of displaced persons, following every lead no matter how thin. She found some, a girl who had been adopted by a family in France under her false name and chose to keep it. A boy who had emigrated to Palestine immediately after liberation and wanted nothing to do with his past, but others simply vanished, swallowed by the war, their fates unknown. Those names haunted Sister Marie Adèle for the rest of her life, the ones she couldn't save, the gaps in her perfect records, the acknowledgement that even her best efforts had limits. Sister Marie Adèle never sought recognition for what she had done, and for decades she didn't receive any. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the focus was on resistance fighters who had blown up bridges and assassinated collaborators, not on a quiet nun who had fought with paperwork. The phantom orphanage she had created existed only in the memories of the children she had saved and in the files she kept locked away. She returned to teaching at the convent, resumed her life of prayers and lessons, and spoke of the war years only when necessary. The Belgian government eventually awarded her a medal for civilian bravery in 1952, a small ceremony attended by a handful of officials who didn't fully understand what she had accomplished. She accepted it with grace, placed it in a drawer, and never displayed it. For her, the war had never ended. It lived in the nightmares she still had, in the faces of the children she couldn't save, in the knowledge that she had lied and forged and manipulated to preserve life in a world designed to extinguish it. The children themselves began to tell her story only decades later, when they were adults with families of their own, when the weight of survival had softened enough that they could speak about it. One by one, they came forward with testimonies about the nun who had given them false names and kept their real ones safe in a metal box. They described how she had drilled them on Catholic prayers, how she had held their hands during Gestapo raids, how she had promised them they wouldn't be forgotten. In 1985, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, recognized Sister Marie Adèle as righteous among the nations, the highest honor given to non-Jews who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. By then, she was 87 years old, frail and nearly blind, but she traveled to Jerusalem to plant her tree in the garden of the righteous. She stood there, surrounded by survivors who owed her their lives, and she wept for the first time since the war, not tears of pride but of grief, for all the ones who hadn't made it, for the parents who died in camps, for the childhoods that were stolen and could never be returned. Sister Marie Adèle passed away in 1991 at the age of 93, in the same convent where she had forged her first baptism certificate 50 years earlier. Her funeral was attended by over 200 people, many of them elderly men and women, who introduced themselves by two names, the Catholic ones she had given them and the Jewish ones she had preserved. They told stories about her stubbornness, her terrifying calm under pressure, her refusal to ever give up on a child once she had taken them in. They spoke of her not as a saint, though many called her that, but as a warrior who had fought a war most people never understood. A war where the weapons were pens and paper, where the battlefield was a ledger book, and where victory was measured not in territory gained, but in lives quietly, invisibly saved. The phantom orphanage she created saved an estimated 1,012 Jewish children over the course of the war, though the exact number will never be known because many of her records were destroyed or lost. What is known is that Sister Marie Adèle's system of false identities, forged documents and coordinated safe houses became a model for other rescue operations across occupied Europe. Her techniques were copied by other convents, monasteries and resistance cells spreading across Belgium, France and the Netherlands. She proved that you didn't need guns or explosives to fight fascism. You needed patience, precision, and the willingness to lie in service of a truth larger than any one person. She showed that bureaucracy, the very tool the Nazis used to implement genocide, could be turned against them by someone who understood it better than they did. Today, most people have never heard of Sister Marie Adèle or the Institut de la Vierge Fidèle. The convent still stands on Rue de la Glacière in Brussels, though it's no longer a boarding school. A small plaque on the wall commemorates what happened there during the war, but most passers-by don't stop to read it. The metal box containing the original names of the children she saved is now in a museum in Jerusalem. Displayed behind glass, the ink faded but still legible. And somewhere in the world, there are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the children she rescued, people who exist only because a 5'2" nun decided that a piece of paper could be mightier than the entire SS. Her story isn't taught in schools. It doesn't appear in blockbuster films. But it should, because it proves that the most powerful form of resistance isn't always the loudest or the most violent. Sometimes, it's the quiet determination of one person who refuses to let evil win, even if it means spending every night for 3 years forging documents by candlelight, even if it means enduring torture and never breaking, even if it means carrying the weight of 1,000 lives on shoulders that were never meant to bear that kind of burden. Sister Marie Adèle didn't just save children. She preserved the very idea that in the darkest moments of human history, there are still people who will risk everything to do what is right. And that might be the most important story we can tell.